who is telling the story, what the story is that is being told. And
it's beautiful. It's not imbued too heavily with trauma.
I felt like RuPaul with my lion hair.
Which basically treats language like the oily sheen on puddles on the gutters of our sidewalks, reflecting the city scenes around us.
Absolutely. Books are the best gift. You're giving entire worlds to people. Oh my God, of course.
Hello. Welcome to episode 6 of the Coach House Podcast, Christmas edition. We got booksellers with Christmas book gift tips. Poets do poety things. But first, we have a first-hand account of what it's like to win the Giller Prize. This year, Coach House was fortunate enough to have 2 books on the Giller Prize shortlist. Lesser-known monsters of the 21st century by Kim Fu, and a win for The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayr. Personally speaking, this was my first time at an awards ceremony this fancy, let alone any awards ceremony. But we wanted to ask Suzette herself about how she felt about the night. Hi, Suzette.
Hi.
Congratulations on winning the Giller Prize.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Holy smokes.
You just got back from Mexico, even.
Yeah. I was in Mexico City having dinner with the ambassador there and people from Scotiabank. And then again we went to Guadalajara, and I was part of a presentation at the Guadalajara Book Fair. So it was pretty amazing. Yeah.
This is pretty fancy stuff.
It's super, super fancy. Super fancy. I had to crack out the frocks.
We were both at the ceremony the night you won, you obviously, and me, fortunately, as well. That was the fanciest party I've ever been to.
I've never been to anything like that in my life. And, and when the invitation said black tie formal, I'm like, I don't even know what that means. It's so not part of my lifestyle. So, yeah, it was pretty wild. And also seeing how people cleaned up and had their suits on and their ties, it was pretty interesting.
It was nice seeing everyone clean up. I felt like there was definitely a layer of like people I was seeing of like, you cleaned up and you own that tuxedo and are used to wearing it.
Yeah. That's true. It's true. Yeah.
Did you feel, I mean, obviously we know it was an honor and how happy you were and your incredible speech, but were you like me? Did you feel a little uncomfortable with this pomp and circumstance we all had to do here?
I totally did. It's just so not part of my wheelhouse. Like I said, I've never been at an event like that ever. And the other thing that was freaking me out was all the cameras and, knowing that we were all on national television, so you better not have food on your face or, don't spill anything on yourself. So, yeah, it was surreal. There's, it's so inadequate as a word, but it was totally surreal. It was unbelievable.
What was the anticipation like? Were you really scared about it? Was it exciting at least to get dressed up or?
Well, I was trying to be really zen about it, and I was actually pretty calm because I thought, I can't control anything here. I've had a wild time. What a ride this has been. I got to know the other writers. They were so awesome. And it is what it is, and I have 1 out of 5 chance, and probably somebody else will win. And I just had a really fancy dinner and bought some new clothes, and that's great. And then, but the problem was that I had so many people asking me, how do you feel? So how do you feel? How are you feeling? How you feeling okay? How do you feel? And so I just kept getting more and more ramped up. It was like, I was feeling fine until everybody was asking me how to feel. And it's like, I don't know how I'm supposed to feel now. So that freaked me out. And I also, I was trying to be very yogic and whatever, but I noticed that as I was eating that dinner, my stomach was getting smaller and smaller, and it's like I can't eat any of this. And Rawi Haj, I think, had told me that happens. You don't actually notice the food anymore, and I was shocked because the food was really, I would have scarfed that down normally, but suddenly my stomach shrank to the size of a pea. Couldn't get anything in there. So
I'm a nervous sipper myself. Like I always have a cup of something around me and I'm always sipping, and they were being very generous with filling wine that night. Yeah. And I remember just touching the liquid to my tongue at a certain point. Like I needed to keep doing something with my hand, but I didn't want to keep drinking wine. So I just touch it with my tongue. And that was enough at that point.
It's true. You don't want to get dry mouth. I stayed away from booze before because I wanted to be in the moment. And then
that was a good idea.
Boozed up later. Yeah.
Yeah, we all did. Like I said, this was, and you agree, this was one of the fanciest parties ever. What would you want someone to know? What was the really weird factor, the wow factor you walked away with? Like, what did you want someone to know about this style of event that they may not?
The whole idea of hair and makeup before was pretty. I've never encountered anything like that in my entire life. And we all came out. We came out with makeup for television, so we had these very pancake makeup faces. I felt like RuPaul with my lion hair. I did not look like myself, but I thought, these people know what they're doing. They're professionals. I'm just going to leave it. And thank God I did, because I don't know. Although the makeup did smear after a while. And then the other thing, too, is when we were rehearsing for the night, they had giant cardboard placeholders in our seats with our faces on them. And so there was me sitting beside Andre, Alexis, and it was real. I wanted to take one home, but they took them away, so I didn't get a chance to take it home.
Somebody's sitting there with a bunch of cutouts of Canadian literary people, having their own little dinner party with everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Cardboard dinner party. Yeah.
Reenacting their own Giller win. Like, yeah, I did it.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a hard left turn because our producer, Andrew Kaufman, insisted I help make this segment Christmas oriented.
Okay.
So now we're going to not talk about the Gillers for a second. Quick question. Should we give books for Christmas? Should our books good gifts? Should we give them?
Absolutely. Books are the best gift. You're giving entire worlds to people. Oh my God, of course. Books are the best present.
Suzette Mayr, thank you for appearing on the Coach House podcast. And congratulations once again on winning the 2022 Giller Prize for Fiction. The Scotiabank Giller Prize for Fiction, I should say.
That's right. Thank you for inviting me. It's a huge pleasure. And I love Coach House. And I hope you have a great holiday.
Oh, happy holidays, Suzette.
Okay, thanks. Bye. You too.
Obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you are firmly aware that books make the perfect gifts. We rounded up 3 of the wisest booksellers from across Canada to get their advice for picking the perfect books for Christmas. We'll hear from Patricia Massey at Massey Books, Kalpana Patel from Type Books, but first, I dropped by Flying Books in Toronto to talk with Martha Sharp. I'm with Martha Sharp at Flying Books in Toronto. She is the founder and publisher of both the bookstore and the imprint associated with it. Martha.
Yes?
Can you please recommend a book for Christmas?
I'm going to recommend 2 books. The first one is called Happy Hour by Marlo Granados. And it's a wonderful friendship novel. It's set in New York City in the summer of 2013. And it has a very golden age of Hollywood vibe to it. The 2 friends, Issa and Gala, wrap their arms around, throw themselves into New York City that summer. And it's just, it's beautiful. It's not imbued too heavily with trauma. And it has a gentle critique of capitalism if you really pay attention. The second one is Good Girl by Anna Fitzpatrick. And it's got a kind of a Fleabag vibe. It's a little bit spicy. The main character is a bookseller, so we love her. Her name is Lucy, and Lucy is torn between her. It's important to her to be a good person, hence good girl, but she's also discovering how to BDSM, and so how to be a good girl in that way.
And these are your books. You publish them.
We publish both of them here, and we love them so much, and actually reread them regularly and recommend them to happy customers all the time. They're available across the country.
Hello, this is Kelpna from Type Books in Toronto, and my tip for holiday book buying is to give a book that you read and loved. Doesn't matter if you don't know what the taste of the person you're buying for is. If you read a book and loved it, gift it. It's the best way to share books. Books are so personal. We use them to connect. If you don't think the other person is going to like it, don't worry, because if they like you, they will appreciate the fact that you are sharing something that you love so much with them.
My name is Patricia Massey. I am a member of the Asni Wachi Niyao Nation in northern BC. I am the owner and operator of Massey Books, an Indigenous woman-owned bookstore on the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations, also known as Vancouver, BC. When I think about what customers should know when buying books as gifts for the holidays, I always say that purchasing books for others is risky business. If you want to ensure you're getting something for somebody that they've never read before, I'd say you have to have a little bit of insight into your subject. Perhaps have had previous conversations about what they've read or what they're currently fascinated by. Maybe bring the book you're thinking of getting them up in casual conversation and see if the theme resonates with them. If you're still unsure, I'd say go to an independent bookstore, because you should always go to independent bookstores. Definitely not Chapters or Indigo. The recommendations are always top-notch. As a bookseller, I would ask, what does this person normally read? Tell me about them. Do they like short stories or epics? Beach reads or life-changing narratives? From there, we can find you the perfect book match for your recipient.
The unofficial, or maybe the official patron saint of Coach House Books has always been B.P. Nicol. We've always had a flair for visual poetry, and the tradition is going strong. But what exactly is visual poetry, and how could you possibly explain it on a podcast? We here at the Coach House podcast have never been afraid of the impossible. That's why we got Derek Beaulieu and Matthew James Weigel to discuss why visual poetry is thought of as being so difficult.
Derek, who are you?
Hi, my name is Derek Beaulieu. I'm a poet and writer, and I live in Banff town site in the middle of Banff National Park, halfway up a mountain, where I'm the Director of Literary Arts at the Banff Centre, and I'm the poet and author of a new book out of Coach House Books called Surface Tension, which basically treats language like the oily sheen on puddles on the gutters of our sidewalks, reflecting the city scenes around us, and letting language kind of drip and congeal around our reading. It's been part of the journey I've been taking as a writer for the last few decades, exploring how we read and how language actually looks when it surrounds us in our day-to-day. And I'm really happy to be here as part of the conversation.
I love the way you talk about that book. Matthew, who are you?
Hi, my name is Matthew James Weigel. I'm a Dene and Métis poet and artist living in Edmonton. I recently came out with a book called White Mud Walking with Coach House Books, and it's largely about me and the place I live and the history of treaty and colonial archival practices in this place and how those all kind of impact us in the future and the present.
Thank you both for coming to the Coach House podcast. I want to get started real quickly because I wanted both of you, for our listeners, we're going to do something interesting. We're going to talk about visual poetry, which they can't see because, we're on a podcast. But But first of all, I wondered if one of you could volunteer to just give us just the quickest of descriptions of visual poetry for you, your own personal description. Derek?
Okay. Visual poetry to me is poetry that takes all the things that we might understand about traditional poetry, poetry that is to be read, and adds to that poetry that is to be looked at, a poetry that treats letters and punctuation like physical objects, like things to be moved around the page, and creates a poetry that is closer to when we look at graphic design or logos or advertising, and tries to take those lessons and present a new type of poetry, a poetry that sits, as I said, between reading and looking into something that feels maybe a little bit more contemporary or a little bit more reflective of how we read in our day to day. That to me is where visual poetry sits.
Matthew, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's an excellent answer. I really like that idea that it's the sort of building off of our visual intuitions or our intuitions of what visual arts or design communication practices have to say to us, and then looking at the poetry in that or applying those to poetry. That's really cool.
One of the things that I feel is always associated with poetry in general, but visual poetry specifically, is that it's difficult, that this is something that needs a lot of background to approach, that it needs an explanation. That's why I just asked you guys to give a quick explanation for it for people who aren't familiar. But I'm really wondering, is this difficult? Is this something that people need to be worried about approaching? Matthew, do you want to start us off this time?
Sure. I don't think so. I don't know if it's hard or any harder than a quote unquote normal poem. I think because we get to use those visual intuitions as sort of readers of visual poetry or viewers of visual poetry, it happens very quickly and very intuitively and emotionally and in the body. And I think that makes visual poetry both incredibly accessible, but at the same time, just like any kind of poetry, building off of those intuitions and eliciting those feelings and responses can be a very challenging thing to do in the production of it. But like I said, I think any kind of poem is hard won to get on the paper. So it doesn't matter if it's visual or otherwise.
Derek, how about you? What do you think?
I agree with Matthew. I think all too often we've been taught that poetry is hard and that poetry is alienating, or poetry is something that needs to be decoded. And visual poetry, because it doesn't even look like the things that we taught were hard, we assume it's even harder. When in fact, I think it's the opposite. I think that we don't look at the Starbucks logo or a sign in an airport and think that's hard, that's difficult, or I don't know what that means. That I think contemporary poets are looking for a contemporary way of speaking difference in a way that actually uses the tools, the things that surround us that are different, as a means of articulating that message, where the form, the difference, it looks different, matches the content. It's speaking of something different, and actually doing that in a way that is true and honest and surprising and new, and allowing ourselves to be curious towards that only leads to learning and play and appreciation.
For two poets who are using a lot of visual elements, both of your new collections, White Mud Walking and Surface Tension, use a lot of text. In fact, are sort of text-based in some way. Matthew, yours is obviously very much about archival text and treaties that you encountered. And Derek, you have these beautiful little essays that sort of bookend all the sections in it that sort of go on and talk sort of a lot about a lot of what you just said. I guess I'm wondering, where does the visual come in for you? Like, if you're thinking in these ways, in these ways of using text and stuff, at what point does it stop being conventional in the way that a conventional poem works or conventional text works? At what point does you start manipulating it into something visual? Is that something you even know? Is that something that you can describe? What point, Derek?
I think to me it's not a stop and start thing. It's just kind of, it's something I've been exploring for a while, and I believe that I try to bring forward like I said, a means of looking and a curiosity, and I try to create poetry that surprises me. That if I look down and as I'm making something, I think like, oh, I didn't expect this to match up with that, or these words or these letters to move in this direction instead of that direction. If I'm surprised or challenged, then to me that's a good sign. That shows that I'm doing something I didn't expect, and if I didn't expect it, then maybe the reader will also join me in that discovery. And ideally, I'm learning in the writing, and hopefully I'll be learning from when the reader receives this text, that it begs conversation. It asks to be replied to, and asks, I hope, like a lot of contemporary books, it asks, what do we do now? What comes next? And I see that, for instance, a lot in Matthew's book. When you see this text and you're confronted with the words literally moving off the page, it asks, what do we do next? What's our next step? What do we, as readers and writers and participants, what do we do to fill these spots?
Matthew, I'm interested in your answer on this too, because your book came out of text-based research, right? Like you were in archives at this point. So at what point did you feel like you needed to use or wanted to use visual elements in this sort of flood of text that you were encountering?
Yeah, I think my answer is probably very similar to Derek's. I've been thinking a lot about listening lately, and the practice of listening and what that means and the spaces that it creates. And I think that when I'm starting out on a particular piece, I don't necessarily know how it's going to be realized in the end. And so there's a lot of listening and feeling and thinking through the work and the process and what that poem is asking and what that poem is telling me. And I think that that's a general practice for all of my visual art. And it can be very difficult to listen and to be in a space to receive what the work that you're sort of almost collaborating with in a certain way, right? Like it's not to say that the work was always there to begin with, but that as you are engaged in this work of creation and creativity, there's a lot of listening to yourself and the world around you that you have to do. And so when it comes to archival materials, there's a great deal of thinking that I think needs to be done and listening that needs to be done of who is telling the story, what the story is that is being told, and why those things are in an inaccessible space, why they need to be brought out or shared, and being receptive to those things, whatever they happen to be, is I think an integral part of that practice.
Do you think readers who are struggling to appreciate these elements within poetry are trying too hard? I'm always reminded of when people complain about abstract art, and one of the major comments is like, oh, my kid could do that in about 5 seconds. And I always think that's fantastic, right? Like that's amazing. Like Jean-Michel Basquiat was like, quoted as saying how influential children's art was on him, for example. Like it wasn't just that he was childlike in his presentation, he was going for that. So I guess I am interested in both your opinions. Like what do you think of when you think of your reader? Do you think this work is accessible for them? Do you worry about them challenging themselves or beating themselves up because they don't get it the first time? You've both had experiences in academia as well. Like you've encountered other people dealing with this material. Why do people just go too hard on themselves? Should we just think less when encountering this kind of stuff? Matthew?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know when I hear that booksellers wonder if my book is full of misprints or is a misprint and was not constructed correctly, is it supposed to look like this? I think that's a really interesting way into the work. If you're asking yourself those sort of conceptual questions of like, what is this? What is happening right now? And that's very interesting to me. And it's not that I'm trying to unsettle people or make them feel confused. It's that when you look at the whole picture and the parts that are in it, there's a whole range of feelings and concepts that are being brought to bear on the subject. And so I think that it's important for people to have a way in. I think it's important for people to have feelings and thoughts about all the different kinds of work that is in the book. And I think that it's important that some of those poems are meant to be read out loud or shared with people as stories in person, face to face, or on Zoom. And I think that some of those stories and some of those poems are also important to be looked at and thought about. And I don't think you have to think about it too hard. I think that it is just very important to bring your intuition to bear on a thing. And it's okay to not want to engage with some things. I think that's a perfectly reasonable and normal reaction. And I think that poetry is wonderful because it does elicit all of this wide range of approaches. And I think that all of those are important. And as long as someone is willing to go there in the first place, I think that's all that they really need to do.
Derek?
I agree. Once again, it's I think that yes, books like Matthew's and mine do get responses from readers that, is this a mistake, or I don't get this, or even sometimes an aggression like this is dumb, or this is a stupid book. What I hope readers will do for both of our books is slow down and ask questions. If you feel you don't get it, in quotation marks, why? What is it that you think is missing that you're looking for? What is it that you think should be there that isn't? And why do you think it should be there and it isn't there? What is it that seems to be getting in your way? What one of my undergrad and graduate profs was Fred Waugh, and he said it was the responsibility of the poem to set up what he called baffles, things that stood in your way, that it's not about smooth communication. It's about setting up a series of problems and things that make you stop and make you slow down and consider. But readers aren't always ready to accept the idea that it's okay to not know. And that books like ours can actually allow you the space to not know and ask why not. What is it about what I thought a poem was that isn't here, and how does that make me feel? Or what is it that I thought a poem should be that I'm not seeing here, and why do I feel upset about that? Or what is it that this message is, like this poem is telling me, that I disagree with? And why is that a problem? And I think that to me, a successful book of poetry should not only ask questions, but ideally encourage dialogue, encourage you to engage, or maybe even write back and say, like, I wanted this for these reasons, and I'm not seeing it, and I don't know what to do. And that spot of, I don't know what to do, well, I love being there as a poet. And I hope that people will love being there as a reader.
My last question for you both is, I wondered if you could talk quickly about what's it like to see the final product of your book? And I ask this for both of you who've used visual elements really interesting ways where it couldn't really turn out the same if you were looking at your manuscript on the computer, right? Like if it was all text based, you're looking at your novel or your conventional book of lyrical poems, right? It looks more or less like it's going to look out. But for both of you, you did such amazing things in your books that you couldn't just be scrolling through a Word document and get the impression of what was coming here. So I guess I'm asking you as both visual poets, how do you picture your final product? How do you use special software? Do you scroll through it on your computer, or what's it like? You must feel like utter wizards when you finally have this this product in your hand. I ask this as a conventional lyrical poet who is so totally baffled when he sees this. Like, what was going through your mind when you started splitting the text, or the E smears onto the second page, or whatever, Derek? I'm sorry, this is an abstract question, but it's a bit of an abstract conversation.
No, I love it. I think that's one of the great things about, having worked with Coach House for this, is that the materiality of the book when you actually get it and you hold it in your hand, and the paper is so tactile and you can smell the ink. There's a real physicality there that it's thrilling. And you're right, you feel like a wizard, like you conjured this out of your imagination and onto paper. And it's every time I publish a book, it's a thrill. When you, as an author, you get that box and you open it up and you're like, holy smokes, it actually happened. It's always a leap of faith. It's always as I said, trying to like conjure your imagination into reality. Like, if I dream this hard enough, it will actually look like that on a piece of paper. And it does. The process is tricky because I think there's a lot of imagining, a lot of picturing it on the Word doc or on the PDF, and it's like, maybe more over there, maybe over there. And then once you start the proofing process and you're still looking at PDFs, you're still looking at pieces of paper with little page will be cut here marks on them, it's still an act of faith. But that's kind of what poetry is like this real belief that you can conjure something out of nothing, out of smoke, and have it live on a piece of paper. It's a thrill every time.
Matthew, do you feel like a wizard?
I guess so. I think I think that's an interesting question, because as Derek said, there's this faith-based element. You're hoping and you're conjuring, and you don't necessarily know what's going to come out at the other end. And I know that like my book has so much engagement with the material and the physical and the land and what it feels to be like, what it feels to be in a place doing things and holding things and looking at things, and how those things reciprocally impact you. And I think that's the important part, is that I don't know what the book is going to look like when it's done, but I do know how holding it makes me feel. And that's an incredible feeling, not just as an artist, but as someone who spent a lot of time, in design. Like you asked about software. And so I spent many hours in design trying to make it all work, and sometimes doing things over and over and over again because the page sizes changed. And even something so simple as what size and shape the book will be is an incredibly complicated question that most people don't think about, and probably shouldn't think about, because it's such a simple detail. And it's not necessary. Most people don't notice when the book is a 1/4 inch wider than another book, or taller. But when you're actually constructing a book from nothing, that is a very important question. And I think that's the thing that you can't know how it's going to feel when it's done. And because there's so many of those little important questions that you have to answer along the way. And it feels amazing. Like I had these, when you're working with conceptual sort of pieces, like the one that runs through the center of the book, and kind of spills outside of the book, you don't you have an idea, and I think I can make a model of it. Like I can print out paper and I can look at it and flip through it and try to get an idea of it, but it's not the same as the finished product. And so I'm really grateful that everyone at Coach was both incredibly patient and incredibly generous with me trying to figure out what size and shape the book should be.
I'm just blown away. It's a mystery for everyone. I figured you guys would know exactly what was going on. Matthew, Derek, thank you for appearing on the Coach House podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you.
That was our show. Have a great Christmas season, everybody, and talk to you in the new year.